quote, the project of containment of Trump has been much more successful than its critics feared. But not everyone is sold on that. The authors of a new book, How Democracies Die, has spent their careers studying the collapse of democracies, and they see cause for concern. Co-authors of that book, Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, both professors of government at Harvard, are here with me tonight. Let's start on this question. There are a lot of sort of takes a year in saying things are not as bad as we feared they would be, or the worst fears of what would happen in terms of the ways that the president has been contained by the courts, been contained by his staff, sometimes contained by his party. What do you guys make of that?
Yeah, well, I think we're generally...
Go ahead.
We're generally, you know, and in some respects, there's reasons for optimism. American democracy is one of the oldest democracies in the world. Our checks and balances, some of our institutions of checks and balances have worked. Our courts, as you say, the media, social institutions such as media have done a great job. But one of our key institutions, one of the key checks, the Congress, has really played a kind of lapdog role under the control of the Republicans and has in many instances served as a shield for President Trump. And so in this sense, we're not quite so confident that things are working out as well as we would hope them to.
Steve, one of the things you write about in the book is you know, you've done all this work on other democracies and they've had sort of democratic slippage. And for people in the U.S., there's all this sort of cry of this is not normal, I've never seen this before. What do you see in this first year? What have you seen that looks familiar to you from the work that you've done in democracies that have experienced retrenchment?
Well, I think one of the most common things that we've seen and that we have seen in the United States is the Trump administration's efforts to go after what we call the referees, the agencies that serve as neutral arbiters in our democratic system, law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies, and the courts. Those are critical institutions in any democracy, and they're almost always among the first institutions that an elected authoritarian goes after in an effort to turn them, to gain their loyalty, to use them as shields against investigation, against prosecution on the one hand, and then eventually to use them as weapons against opponents. And that's one of the first and one of the most damaging things that, though not always successfully, that Trump has tried to do is go after to capture the referees, to bring them over to his side, to politicize them, and ultimately to use them as weapons against his opponents.
You know, you have these
This is something...
Yeah, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, it's something we see in virtually every electoral authoritarian regime we've studied, almost without exception.
Daniel, can you give specific examples of places where you've seen this kind of disintegration happen specifically in this way?
Yeah, so, I mean, this happens. So one of the key points that we make in the book is that the way democracies die today is not through military coups, but increasingly since the Cold War, the election of politicians who, you know, are elected, so in that sense have democratic legitimacy, but once in office go after democratic institutions. So, and this has happened quite frequently recently since the collapse of communism. So Viktor Orban in Hungary, you know, once he came into power in the early 2000s, one of the things he did was to impose a retirement age very quickly on judges so that he could then stack the courts up with all of his allies. And so one sees this kind of thing, and this happened also in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. And so this happened really. Erdogan in Turkey has done similar things where after being investigated, his family was being investigated for corruption, December 2013, as they got closer and closer to his family, the chief prosecutor was fired, and all sorts of prosecutors, thousands of prosecutors have been fired since then. So this, again, is a pattern that we see. I mean, we do think the American system of checks and balances, the fact that we're having these very public debates about this in the United States right now is a good sign, because often these kinds of things happen in the kind of dead of night. So the fact that these are happening in the public, there's lots of media coverage of these, and there's lots of pushback, gives us room for hope, but we should definitely not take democracy for granted.
You know, this question about which institutions hold, Steve, I mean, and you talk about the neutral arbiters, the referees, you know, I keep having this thought about, there's the famous Andrew Jackson Trail of Tears situation in which the court rules against him and he basically just says, well, you know, screw you, I'm going to do it anyway. And we've been talking about the president and Mueller, and if Mueller compels a subpoena, the idea that things just hold because people assent to their authority. You know, the danger of not assenting to that authority, and how palpable or real you think that is in our current circumstance.
I think they're more real today than they have been in many decades. I mean, as you pointed out, it's not the rules themselves that that bind us and that bind our politicians. It's an agreement among our entire political elite, among both parties, that they will use our rules with restraint. And there is increasingly, as norms of restraint erode in this country, driven mostly by the Republican Party, there is a sense that among both parties now that politicians should use any means necessary to win, even if that means really pushing at the margins. So, go back to Nixon. At the end of the day, Nixon complied with orders of the court. It's not as clear today, a generation and a half later, whether the president would do the same thing.
It's funny you bring that up because I've been listening to the Slate podcast, Slow Burn on Watergate, and when they get to the tapes section and they try all these different feints to get out of it, and ultimately they just are like, well, we're caught, we're going to turn them over. You think to yourself, well, they could have just burned them. They could have said, well, no. And the fact they didn't is the turning point for the story. So I guess, David, the question to you is, what are ways that those institutions get strengthened? What can people do? What lessons have you learned about preventing against this kind of retrenchment?
Yeah, no, it's a very hard situation because facing a leader with authoritarian tendencies, we're in a very tough spot because there's a bit of a dilemma. I mean, on the one hand, certainly Democrats and opponents of Donald Trump who are fearful about this need to fight hard. They need to stand up for their principles. They need to win elections. But on the other hand, they need to also do so in a way that reinforces our democratic norms. And this is something that's sometimes hard to do because we think if there's so much at stake, maybe we need to fight like the other side. But this is an old dilemma. And when we've looked around the world and looked throughout history, whenever Democrats face this dilemma and make the choice to abandon this kind of self-restraint, it ends badly. And so really the thing that we are concerned about and the thing that we're kind of worried about is really that there's a kind of spiraling effect can take place in which people fight back in ways that end up damaging our democracy.
All right, Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, thank you both for your time. It's a fascinating book. Before we go, a quick reminder, if you can't catch us live, you should tune into the All In with Chris Hayes podcast. You can listen to our entire show for free wherever you get your podcasts. That's all in this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thanks, my friend.
You bet.
And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. If you enjoy roller coasters, if those are the sorts of things that make you feel excited and not just barfy, then you have already been enjoying Today in the News, haven't you? This is what's going on right now in the Asian markets, where the time difference, of course, means it is tomorrow there already. Markets are open and trading. What's happening in the Asian markets right now is important news in the United States tonight because the Dow Jones went off a cliff again today. It has been a crazy few days in terms of the U.S. stock market. The Asian markets right now make it look like it might be another bad day tomorrow, but who knows? It's really been all over the place. Friday, as you remember, the Dow dropped a beastly 666 points. Then we had the weekend. Then on Monday at one point, the Dow was down 1,600 points. It ended up at the end of the day closing down around 1,200 points. Then Tuesday, the Dow was actually up 567 points. Wednesday, it was almost perfectly flat, at least by the end of the day. But now today, it dropped another 1,000 points. And at first it looked like when this all started, maybe there was a little hiccup in the markets. Now, after these 5 days, it's more like a violent sneezing fit, and nobody knows when it's going to stop or where it's going to stop. So whether or not you personally have got a stake in the stock market, it's unsettling to see the market like this. This is the Dow since November. I think we've got a shot of that. Yeah, this time frame was posted on the front page of the Washington Post.